Olive Pruitt had 11 seconds to make someone see her before the man holding her wrist reached the parking lot. 11 seconds before he put her in a car and drove away from the only place her mother would know to look. 11 seconds to convince a stranger that the yellow dress, the whitened grip marks, the rigidity in her 8-year-old shoulders, that all of it meant exactly what it looked like. She made the signal twice. Nobody stopped. But the third time, when her left hand rose to her sternum on the courthouse steps and her thumb tucked beneath 4 trembling fingers, a man in a black Hells Angels vest froze 3 steps from the bottom. And in the half-second before he moved, Olive Pruitt understood something she would carry for the rest of her life. Being saved doesn't always look like rescue. Sometimes it just looks like someone who refuses to look away. This is Olive and Kane's story, and the part that will stay with you isn't the courthouse square, or the 113 motorcycles that showed up, or even the $231,400 in fraud that unraveled in a single night. It's what happened when one man decided that 17 years of grief had taught him exactly how to see what everyone else was trained to miss. If you believe a child's silent plea deserves an answer, subscribe, because what happens next proves that sometimes being seen is the entire world. Tell me where you're watching from below. Now. Here's what Olive whispered when Kane Darden knelt in front of her and said the only 4 words that mattered. He said my mom sent him. Her voice was so small, Kane almost didn't hear it over the flagpole rope snapping in the September wind. But he heard the tremor underneath, the sound of a child who'd been holding terror in her chest for 11 minutes and was now, finally, allowed to let it crack. Kane Darden had come down the south steps of the Toombs County Courthouse at 5:47 p.m. on a Thursday, with nothing more urgent on his mind than filing vehicle registration paperwork for 2 chapter bikes. Mundane business, the kind he handled himself because he'd learned, over 22 years in the Marines, and 19 years wearing a Hells Angels patch, that paperwork was where problems lived. He was 3 steps from the bottom when the movement caught his peripheral vision. A little girl, maybe 8 years old, yellow dress with white buttons down the front, ironed flat that morning by someone who cared. White canvas sneakers with a small sunflower drawn on the left toe in red marker. Walking beside a man in khaki pants and a collared polo shirt. The kind of man whose appearance screamed harmless so loudly it made Kane's jaw tighten. The girl's left hand came up, rested against her sternum, her thumb folded into her palm. 4 fingers curled over it, trapping it. 3 seconds, then her hand dropped. Kane's hand went to the courthouse railing, not for balance, because something had just hit him in the chest with the force of a name he carried on the inside of his left wrist in careful black script. Caleb, March 14th, 2007. He watched for 4 more seconds. He counted the grip on her wrist, tight enough that the skin around the man's fingers had gone white. He counted the rigidity in her shoulders, the way an 8-year-old should never walk. He counted the way her head turned fractionally, sweeping the courthouse square like she was looking for anyone. Anyone at all. On the 5th second, Kane Darden came down the last 3 steps. He did not run. He did not shout. He moved the way 22 years of explosive ordnance disposal had trained him to move toward something dangerous, with purpose and without theater. The man in the khaki pants was 15 feet from the post office parking lot when Kane fell into step beside them. Natural, easy, like a cousin who'd been parking his bike around the corner and just happened to cross paths. "Hey," Kane said, his voice carrying the measured warmth of someone asking for directions. "That your little girl?" The man's head turned. His smile went up, practiced, professional. The smile of someone who'd answered this question before and knew exactly how to make it go away. "My niece," Randall Crutchfield said smoothly. "Thursdays are our day. Ice cream and the park. She's at that age where everything's a production. You know how it is." He said it with the patient tolerance of a tired uncle, the kind of line that worked on teachers, on social workers, on the 2 school board members who'd walked past them 90 seconds ago and chosen to believe it. Kane looked at Olive. Her eyes were dark and wide, and filled with something Kane recognized from 17 years of sitting in DFCS waiting rooms and reading case files and learning the specific way terror looks on a child's face when the adults have stopped listening. "I see you, sweetheart," Kane said quietly, dropping his voice so only she could hear it. "I see your signal." Olive Pruitt's eyes filled. She did not cry. But her left hand, the one Crutchfield wasn't gripping, came up again, slower this time, and pressed flat against her chest. Not the signal, just her palm, over her heart, like she was checking to make sure it was still beating. Kane's jaw tightened. He looked back at Randall Crutchfield, whose smile had gone rigid at the edges. "You know what?" Kane said, his tone still friendly but with something underneath now, something Crutchfield's survival instincts were starting to register as a problem. "I've got a daughter about this age, and when she's scared she gets real quiet, real still, just like your niece here." He let that sit for 2 seconds. "So I'm gonna ask you one more time, and I need you to think real careful about your answer. Is this your niece?" Crutchfield's hand tightened on Olive's wrist. A flash of calculation crossed his face. The math of a man trying to decide if the person in front of him knew enough to be dangerous or just enough to be annoying. "I don't know what you think you saw," Crutchfield said, his voice dropping the warmth now, "but you need to step back before this becomes a legal issue. I'm a licensed foster care coordinator. This child is in my care. And you're interfering with—" "With what?" Kane interrupted. His voice hadn't risen. It had gotten quieter, the kind of quiet that made the courthouse square feel smaller. "With you walking her to a car she doesn't want to get into. With you gripping her wrist hard enough to leave marks." Olive made a small sound. Not a word, just a broken exhale that hit Kane like a punch. He knelt, right there on the sidewalk 3 feet from the post office parking lot, in front of 11 people who were still walking past like nothing was happening. He went down to Olive's level, and he held out his left hand, palm up, the inside of his wrist facing her. The name Caleb in script faced the afternoon light. "You did everything right," Kane said, his voice impossibly gentle now. "That signal you made. That's why I'm standing here. Nobody's taking you anywhere. You hear me? Nobody." Olive looked at the name on his wrist. She didn't know what it meant, but she understood, in the way children sometimes understand what adults think they're hiding, that this man had carried something heavy for a very long time. She decided to trust the weight. "He's not my uncle," she whispered. "I don't know him. He said my mom sent him to pick me up from the community center. She didn't. I tried to tell the counselor 3 weeks ago. He gave me a weird feeling. She said he's a nice man. He volunteers every Thursday. He knows my mom's name. He knows where she works. He knew I'd be waiting." Her voice broke. Kane's hand closed into a fist at his side. "3 weeks ago I heard him on the phone," Olive continued, the words spilling out now in the desperate rush of someone who'd been holding them for too long. "He was in his car. I was on the community center steps. He said the woman has a daughter, Thursdays. He said that's why Marcus Tilley didn't go anywhere. I memorized it. I didn't know what it meant, but his voice sounded like he was talking about something he already decided, and I knew it was bad." Kane's blood turned to ice in his veins. Marcus Tilley. The name hit him like a freight train because Kane Darden had been building a file on New Horizons Youth Services for 14 months. Quietly, methodically, the way a man who'd learned to read case files and track patterns did when something in his gut told him an organization that handled vulnerable children and never generated complaints was an organization that made complaints disappear. Marcus Tilley's name was in that file. a 16-year-old who'd filed a formal DFCS complaint in March 2021, alleging abuse during his placement under Randall Crutchfield's care. A complaint that had been logged, assigned to intake, then administratively set aside pending additional documentation that was never requested and never received. Kane stood, slowly. His full height, 6'3", 238 pounds, the kind of size that arrived before the man did. He looked at Randall Crutchfield, whose face had gone carefully blank. "Marcus Tilley," Kane said quietly. "You want to tell me about Marcus Tilley?" Crutchfield's expression didn't change, but something flickered behind his eyes, the recognition that the man in front of him knew a name he shouldn't know. "I don't know what this child has told you," Crutchfield said, his voice taking on the measured cadence of someone trained in trauma-informed care. "But I'm a licensed professional. I've worked with DFCS for 9 years. I've passed every background check, and if you don't step aside right now, I will have you arrested for harassment and false imprisonment." Kane pulled his phone from his vest pocket. He didn't break eye contact. He pressed 3 buttons. The call connected on the second ring. "Coldwater," Kane said. "I need you at the Toombs County Courthouse, South Steps, right now. Bring everyone you can reach in the next 10 minutes. And call Alma Pritchard. Tell her I've got a foster care coordinator trying to walk away with a child who just told me about Marcus Tilley." A pause. Then a voice on the other end. Gravelly, steady. The voice of a man who'd spent 22 years as a Toombs County Sheriff's detective and knew exactly what that name meant. "We're rolling." The line went dead. Kane looked at Randall Crutchfield. "You're not going anywhere," he said. "You're going to stand right here with me and this little girl until the people who actually care about her safety show up. And then you're going to answer a whole lot of questions about how a licensed foster care coordinator knows exactly where to find an 8-year-old on a Thursday afternoon." Crutchfield's jaw tightened. His hand was still locked around Olive's wrist. "This is kidnapping," he said. "You're holding me against my will. That's a felony." "You're welcome to call your attorney," Kane said evenly. "The FBI is going to want to talk to them anyway." The word FBI landed. Crutchfield's face changed, just for a second. The mask slipped and something underneath showed through. Not a predator caught in a trap, but a man who'd been running calculations for 9 years and had just realized the math had finally caught up to him. Olive pulled. Not hard, not dramatically, just a small testing tug on her trapped wrist. The movement of a child who'd been holding still for 11 minutes and was now, finally, starting to believe she might not have to anymore. Crutchfield's grip tightened reflexively. 4 whitened crescents pressed deeper into the back of her hand. Kane's voice dropped to something that made the September air feel colder. "Let her go." And Randall Crutchfield, licensed foster care coordinator, Boy Scout Troop 214 leader, hospital volunteer coordinator, neighborhood watch captain, crisis hotline volunteer, a man whose entire life had been built on institutional trust and community standing, looked into the eyes of a Hells Angel president and understood, finally, that there were some things a clean background check couldn't protect you from. His hand opened. Olive stepped back, stumbled slightly. Kane's hand steadied her shoulder. Gentle, careful, the touch of someone who knew exactly how fragile trust was when it had been shattered. "You're okay," he said quietly. "I've got you." And for the first time in 11 minutes, Olive Pruitt let herself believe it. The sound started low, distant, like thunder building on the horizon. Then it grew. By the time the first Harley-Davidson turned onto Brazell Street, the rumble had become a roar that shook the courthouse windows and set off 2 car alarms in the post office parking lot. Kane had made one call. That call had gone to Cody Coldwater Reese, retired Toombs County Sheriff's detective, 22 years on the force, a man who knew the Georgia DFCS complaint and audit system from the inside because he'd spent 2 decades watching it fail children in ways that kept him awake at night. Coldwater had made 4 more calls. Within 18 minutes of Kane's phone going back in his pocket, 34 motorcycles from the Vidalia home chapter were rolling through downtown. Within 47 minutes, the count had climbed to 113. Savannah sent 31, Augusta sent 27, Macon sent 21. When the call included the words foster care coordinator and child, certain members didn't ask questions. They just showed up. The formation pulled into the courthouse square in disciplined rows, tight, smooth, practiced from years of riding together. They parked one by one in the overflow lot across the street, engines cutting off almost in unison until the sudden silence, after all that noise, felt heavy and expectant. 113 men in black leather vests stepped off their bikes and stood there, not moving, not shouting, simply present. Randall Crutchfield's face had gone the color of old newspaper. Coldwater came first. 57 years old, gray beard, eyes that had seen too many case files close too early. He walked up to Kane, glanced once at Olive, then looked at Crutchfield with the kind of cold professional assessment that came from 2 decades of reading guilty men's faces. "This him?" "This is him," Kane confirmed. "Olive, this is Coldwater. He used to be a detective. He's going to help make sure you get home safe." Coldwater knelt, not as low as Kane had. His knees didn't bend that way anymore, but low enough to meet Olive's eyes. "Sweetheart," he said gently, "I need to ask you some questions. Is that okay?" Olive nodded. Her hand was still pressed to her chest. "The man who was holding your wrist, you said he told you your mom sent him. Did your mom actually send him?" "No." Olive's voice was stronger now. "My mom picks me up from the community center at 6:30 every Thursday after her courthouse shift ends. She's never late. She always brings me a peach from the vending machine. She didn't send anybody." Coldwater's jaw tightened. He pulled a small notebook from his pocket. "You said you heard him on the phone 3 weeks ago. Can you tell me exactly what he said?" Olive closed her eyes. When she spoke, the words came out in the careful, measured cadence of a child who'd memorized something, because she knew it was important. He said, "The audit request came through records. I know who processed it." Then he listened. Then he said, "The paperwork goes back through the same office." Then he said, "The woman has a daughter, Thursdays." Then he said, "That's why Marcus Tilley didn't go anywhere." The courthouse square went very, very quiet. Coldwater looked up at Kane. Something passed between them. The understanding that what this 8-year-old girl had just recited from memory was not the confused fragment of a scared child's imagination, but the exact phrasing of a man discussing how to neutralize an institutional threat by targeting the family member of the person processing his audit paperwork. Coldwater stood. He turned to Randall Crutchfield, who was standing 3 feet from the post office parking lot, with 113 Hell's Angels between him and his car. "Randall Crutchfield," Coldwater said quietly, "licensed foster care coordinator, director of New Horizons Youth Services. I know who you are. I know what you do. And I've known for about 14 months that something in your case files doesn't sit right." He took 1 step forward. "Now I know why." Crutchfield's mouth opened, closed. The charm offensive that had worked on teachers and social workers and community center directors was visibly calibrating, trying to find the right angle, the right words. "I don't know what this child thinks she heard," he started, his voice taking on the patient, reasonable tone of a professional explaining a misunderstanding. "But I can assure you—" "Marcus Tilley," Coldwater interrupted. 16 years old when he filed a formal complaint with DFCS in March 2021. The complaint alleged abuse during his placement under your care. It was logged, assigned to intake, then set aside pending additional documentation. That documentation was never requested. The complaint was never investigated, and you kept billing DFCS for Marcus's placement stipend for 2 more years after he aged out of the system. Crutchfield's face went carefully blank. I'm not discussing confidential case files with $163,700, Coldwater said. That's how much you collected in fraudulent stipend payments for a child who was no longer in your care. And that's just Marcus. I've got a list of 2 more names in case files that don't match your billing records. Ghost placements. Children who exist on paper and nowhere else. He let that sit. The DFCS audit was triggered 6 weeks ago by an anonymous tip. The audit request was routed through the Toombs County Courthouse Records Department. Rebecca Pruitt processed the paperwork. Olive made a small sound. Coldwater's voice gentled. Rebecca Pruitt, your mom. Olive nodded, tears streaming down her face now. She processes DFCS audit paperwork, Coldwater continued, his eyes never leaving Crutchfield's. Which means she's the one who would have handled the initial routing for an audit into New Horizons Youth Services. And you knew that. You knew her schedule. You knew she worked Thursdays. You knew her daughter waited at the community center until 6:30. He took another step forward. You targeted an 8-year-old child because her mother processed paperwork that could destroy you. The courthouse square was silent, except for the distant sound of a screen door and the courthouse flag snapping in the wind. Then a voice cut through the quiet, female, sharp, carrying the authority of someone who'd spent 26 years making arrest decisions. That's enough for me. Detective Alma Pritchard, Toombs County Sheriff's Office, walked into the courthouse square with 2 uniformed deputies behind her. She was 52 years old, graying hair pulled back, eyes that had seen more than she'd ever wanted to, and less than she needed to. She and Kane Darden had a 14-year working relationship that neither of them had ever described to anyone in terms that would fit a form. She'd been a junior detective on the Caleb Darden case in 2007. She'd closed it at her supervisor's instruction. She'd never fully made peace with that. She looked at Kane now. He nodded once. She looked at Olive. Her expression softened. Then she looked at Randall Crutchfield, and her voice went flat and professional. Randall Crutchfield, you're being detained for questioning regarding allegations of child endangerment, attempted kidnapping, and financial fraud related to DFCS billing records. You have the right to remain silent. She read him his rights right there on the courthouse steps, while 113 Hells Angels watched in disciplined silence, and an 8-year-old girl in a yellow dress pressed her hand to her chest, and finally, let herself cry. Randall Crutchfield was taken to the Toombs County Sheriff's Office in the back of a patrol car at 6:14 p.m., his hands cuffed behind his back, his frameless glasses sitting crooked on his face. The drive took 7 minutes. He spent 6 of them staring out the window at the line of motorcycles following 3 car lengths behind, maintaining perfect formation, engines rumbling like a promise that this wasn't over. At 6:22 p.m., while Crutchfield was being processed into holding, Olive Pruitt sat in the courthouse annex conference room with a victim advocate, a glass of water she hadn't touched, and her mother. Rebecca Pruitt had run 4 red lights getting from the records department to the courthouse square. She'd arrived to find her daughter surrounded by men in leather vests and a detective she recognized from the hallways, explaining that Olive was safe, that she'd done everything right, that the man who'd tried to take her was in custody. Rebecca had dropped to her knees on the courthouse steps and held Olive so tightly the girl's ribs ached. And for the first time in 11 weeks, since the day Randall Crutchfield had started volunteering at the community center, and Olive had come home saying a new helper gave her a weird feeling, Rebecca Pruitt had let herself believe her daughter's instincts over a man's credentials. "I should have listened," Rebecca whispered into Olive's hair, her voice breaking. "Baby, I should have listened." "You're listening now," Olive said. And somehow that was enough. Kane stood outside the conference room with Coldwater, watching through the small window in the door as mother and daughter sat together. He didn't go in. This wasn't his moment. His job had been to see the signal, to show up, to make sure the child who'd been counting landmarks, courthouse, post office, hardware store, bank, got to stop counting and start breathing. Coldwater pulled a file folder from the messenger bag slung across his shoulder. He'd brought it with him. Kane recognized it, the same folder Coldwater had been building for 14 months. The one that held every inconsistency in New Horizons Youth Services case records that had made his detective's instincts itch. "Marcus Tilley's complaint is in here," Coldwater said quietly. "Filed March 17th, 2021. The intake supervisor was Denise Holbrook. She retired 6 months later on full pension. Hasn't responded to any contact since." Kane's jaw tightened. "And the complaint?" "Set aside pending additional documentation. The documentation was never specified. Marcus was 16, no attorney, no guardian ad litem, no adult in his life who knew he'd filed it until it was already buried." Coldwater flipped to another page. "Crutchfield made a $4,200 cash withdrawal 3 days after the complaint was logged. Only cash withdrawal in that account's 4-year history." "Payment," Kane said. "That's what I think, but I can't prove it. Not with what I have." Kane looked back through the window at Olive. "What about what she has?" Coldwater followed his gaze. "An 8-year-old's memory of a phone conversation she overheard 3 weeks ago. A defense attorney will tear it apart. Then we find more." Coldwater nodded slowly. "Then we find more. The Vidalia Hells Angels clubhouse sat on a stretch of county road 7 miles outside town. A low brick building with a gravel parking lot, and a sign that read, 'Private Property,' in letters big enough to be read from the highway. By 7:30 p.m., the parking lot held 113 motorcycles, 3 pickup trucks, and Coldwater's 2004 Crown Victoria that refused to die. Inside, the main room smelled like motor oil and coffee that had been sitting too long. A long table dominated the center, scarred wood that had absorbed 2 decades of chapter business. The walls held photographs. Rides, charity events, brothers who'd passed, children who'd been helped in ways that never made the news. Kane stood at the head of the table. Around him sat the men who'd dropped everything and shown up when the call came. Coldwater, 57, the institutional memory. Flintlock Odom, 63, ex-Army combat medic who'd brought the trauma kit he kept strapped under his rear fender and examined Olive's wrist with gentleness that made Rebecca cry. Broadside Hayes, 49, former Toombs County Middle School counselor who'd resigned in 2018 after reporting a student's abuse to administration and watching it get routed to the school board's legal team instead of DFCS. Kettledrum Park, 29, youngest full patch member, former IT contractor who could trace a financial paper trail faster than most people could spell fraud. Chainsaw Mouzon, 71, founding member, whose own son had been placed in state foster care in 1994 and never located after the placement ended. Chainsaw hadn't spoken about that in 27 years. When Kane had called and said what Crutchfield was, Chainsaw hadn't said a word on the phone. He'd just shown up. Kane laid the file folder on the table. Randall Crutchfield, 47, licensed foster care coordinator, director of New Horizons Youth Services, 9 years with DFCS, Boy Scout troop leader, hospital volunteer, crisis hotline volunteer, clean background check, spotless reputation. He paused. And a predator who's been stealing from the state and targeting children for close to a decade. The room went quiet. Olive Pruitt heard him on the phone 3 weeks ago, Kane continued. He said the audit request came through records. He knew who processed it. He knew the paperwork went back through the same office. And he knew that office belonged to Rebecca Pruitt, Olive's mother. Coldwater pulled documents from the folder. DFCS triggered an audit 6 weeks ago based on an anonymous tip. The tip flagged inconsistencies in New Horizons' billing records, specifically, stipend payments for children who weren't in active placements. How much? Broadside asked. Coldwater's voice went flat. We're still tracing it, but initial estimates put it north of 200,000. Chainsaw's fist hit the table. Once, hard enough to rattle the coffee mugs. And the system didn't catch it for 9 years, he said. His voice was quiet, dangerous. The system wasn't looking, Coldwater said. The amounts per child were small enough to avoid automated flags. Crutchfield's credentials produced institutional trust, and the one formal complaint, Marcus Tilley, March 2021, was buried by a supervisor with a documented relationship with the defendant. Denise Holbrook, Kane said, retired 6 months after Marcus filed. Full pension. No forwarding contact. Convenient, Flintlock muttered. Kettledrum opened his laptop. Give me Crutchfield's full legal name and date of birth. If there's a financial trail, I'll find it. Coldwater slid a sheet across the table. Randall Eugene Crutchfield, February 11th, 1977. New Horizons Youth Services is registered as a 501c3. IRS filings show annual revenue of $312,000. Kettledrum's fingers moved across the keyboard. The room waited. 30 seconds passed. Then Kettledrum's expression changed. Got something, he said quietly. New Horizons operating account shows monthly transfers of $4,200 to a personal account in Crutchfield's name, dating back to January 2017. He pulled up another window. That's $50,400 per year, times 7 years. His fingers tapped. That's $352,800 in personal transfers from a nonprofit operating account. That's embezzlement, Broadside said. That's just what I found in 45 seconds, Kettledrum replied. Give me an hour, and I'll give you the full map. Kane leaned forward. What about Marcus Tilley? Can you find the billing records for his placement? Kettledrum's fingers moved again. A minute passed. Then 2. Found him, Kettledrum said. Marcus Andrew Tilley, born June 3rd, 2004, placed with New Horizons Youth Services under Crutchfield's coordination from September 2019 through March 2021. Age during placement, 14 to 16. He scrolled down. Here's where it gets ugly. According to DFCS billing records, Crutchfield collected placement stipends for Marcus from September 2019 through August 2023. The room went very still. Marcus aged out in March 2021, Coldwater said slowly. That's when he filed the complaint. And Crutchfield kept billing for him for 2 more years, Kettledrum confirmed. At $1,850 per month. That's $22,200 per year, times 2.4 years. He paused. 53,200 IDs in fraudulent billings for one child who wasn't even in the system anymore. Chainsaw stood up, walked to the window, stood there with his back to the room. Kane understood. Some math was too heavy to sit still for. Keep going, Kane said quietly. What else? Kettledrum pulled up another screen. There are 2 more names in the billing records with the same pattern. Children with case file numbers that don't correspond to active placements. One shows as aged out in 2020, but billing continued through 2023. The other... He stopped. The other has a social security number that comes back as never issued. Ghost placement, Coldwater said. A child who never existed. Correct. Kettledrum's voice had gone cold. "And Crutchfield's been collecting stipends for this non-existent child since May 2018. That's 5 years at $1,850 per month. Another $111,000 in fraud." He looked up from the laptop. Total fraudulent billings across 3 ghost cases, $164,280. Add the personal transfers from the operating account, $352,800. That's $517,080 in documented theft from a system designed to protect vulnerable children. The silence in that room was the kind that came before violence or justice, depending on which direction the men inside it chose to go. Kane chose justice. "Where'd the money go?" he asked. Kettledrum pulled up another window. Bank records show several large purchases. A 2021 Airstream trailer, 27 feet, purchased for $83,700. Registered to Crutchfield's brother's address in Statesboro. He scrolled. 3.4 acres of undeveloped land on the Altamaha River, purchased under a shell LLC called River Bend Holdings. Purchase price, $71,400. The LLC's registered agent is... He stopped. Randall Crutchfield. What else? Kane's voice was quiet. 6 years of annual membership dues and green fees at Vidalia Country Club. Total, $43,800. Kettledrum looked up. He stole from children who had nothing, and he spent it on a trailer, land, and golf. Chainsaw turned from the window. His face was carved from stone. "How much does Olive's family have?" he asked. Coldwater checked his notes. "Rebecca Pruitt's checking account holds $1,740. No savings, no family nearby. And Crutchfield's documented net worth?" "Approximately $2.1 million, Kettledrum said, "including the fraudulent assets." Chainsaw nodded once. "Then we take it all back." At 8:47 p.m., Kane's phone rang. Unknown number. He answered. "Mr. Darden?" A woman's voice, nervous. "My name is Denise Holbrook. I used to work for DFCS. I heard about what happened today. Need to talk to someone." Kane's eyes met Coldwater's across the table. "I'm listening." "Not on the phone," Holbrook said. "Can you meet me? There's a Waffle House on Highway 280. I'll be there in 20 minutes. "I'll be there in 15, Kane said. The line went dead. Denise Holbrook was 71 years old. She sat in a booth at the back of the Waffle House with a cold cup of coffee and an envelope she kept touching, like she was afraid it would disappear. Kane slid into the booth across from her. Coldwater stood by the door. "Thank you for coming," Holbrook said. Her hands shook. "I've been carrying this for 3 years. I didn't know how to—" "Start at the beginning," Kane said gently. Holbrook nodded. She slid the envelope across the table. March 17th, 2021. Marcus Tilley filed a formal complaint with DFCS alleging abuse during his placement under Randall Crutchfield's care. I was the intake supervisor who received it. The complaint was detailed, specific. It included dates, incidents, witnesses. She paused. My supervisor at the time was Alan Gaines. When I brought Marcus's complaint to him, he told me to set it aside. Said it needed additional documentation before we could proceed. I asked what documentation. He said he'd let me know. He never did, Kane said. No. 2 weeks later, Crutchfield came to the office. Had a meeting with Gaines behind closed doors. An hour. When Crutchfield left, Gaines called me in and told me Marcus's complaint had been resolved internally. Said Marcus had emotional issues, a history of fabrication, and the complaint wasn't credible. Her voice broke. I knew it was credible. I'd read it. I'd seen Marcus's face when he filed it. That boy was telling the truth. Why didn't you push back? Kane asked. Not accusatory, just asking. Because I was 58 years old, and 6 months from retirement, Holbrook said quietly. Because Alan Gaines had the power to make my pension disappear. Because I convinced myself that someone else would catch it. That the system had safeguards. That one buried complaint wouldn't matter in the long run. She looked up, tears streaming down her face. I was wrong. And I've known I was wrong every single day for 3 years. She pushed the envelope closer. That's my personal copy of Marcus Tilley's complaint. I kept it. I don't know why. Maybe because some part of me knew this day would come. That someone would finally ask the right questions. Kane opened the envelope. Inside was a 14-page document, handwritten in careful block letters, signed and dated by Marcus Andrew Tilley. He read the first page. His jaw locked. This is evidence, he said. Yes. You held on to evidence of child abuse for 3 years. Yes. Her voice was barely a whisper. Why bring it to me now? Holbrook looked at him. Because I heard what you did today. I heard a Hell's Angel saw a little girl's signal on the courthouse steps and didn't walk past. And I realized. She stopped. I realized. You did what I should have done 3 years ago. You saw something wrong, and you didn't look away. Kane closed the envelope. This goes to Detective Pritchard. Today. I know. You'll probably be questioned. Maybe charged. I know. Holbrook's hands were still shaking. I don't care anymore. I'm 71 years old. I've got enough money. What I don't have is the ability to look at myself in the mirror. Maybe this helps. Kane stood. He looked down at the woman who'd chosen a pension over a 16-year-old's safety and had spent 3 years drowning in that choice. You should have helped him when it mattered, Kane said quietly. But you're helping him now. That counts for something. He walked out. Coldwater followed. In the parking lot, Kane handed the envelope to Coldwater. Get this to Alma. Tell her Denise Holbrook is willing to testify. Coldwater took it. This changes everything. With Marcus's original complaint and Holbrook's testimony about how it was buried, we've got a pattern. We've got institutional corruption. We've got enough to destroy him, Kane finished. His phone buzzed. Text from Kettledrum. Found the river property. Coordinates attached. You need to see this. The 3.4 acres on the Altamaha River sat at the end of a dirt road that turned to mud in the rain. Kettledrum had pulled the property records and coordinates. Kane, Coldwater, Flintlock, and Broadside arrived at 9:52 p.m. in 2 trucks, with high beams cutting through darkness that smelled like river water and rot. The land was undeveloped. No structure, no utilities, just 3.5 acres of overgrown scrub and a small clearing near the water where someone had set up a fire ring. Why buy land and leave it empty? Broadside asked. You don't, Coldwater said. You buy it because you're planning to use it for something you don't want anyone to see. They searched the clearing. Flintlock found it first, a waterproof storage container buried 18 inches deep under the fire ring, sealed with a combination lock. Coldwater broke the lock with a tire iron. Inside, 3 file folders, each labeled with a child's name, each containing documents that should have been in DFCS case files and weren't. Medical reports showing injuries that were never investigated. Photographs, handwritten notes in Crutchfield's own writing detailing incidents he'd never reported. And in the 3rd folder, a life insurance policy. Beneficiary, Randall Eugene Crutchfield. Insured, Marcus Andrew Tilley. Policy amount, $127,600. Date of policy, February 4th, 2021. Date of Marcus's complaint, March 17th, 2021. 6 weeks. Crutchfield had taken out a life insurance policy on a child in his care 6 weeks before that child filed a complaint that could have destroyed him. Coldwater's hands were shaking when he closed the folder. "He was going to kill him," Broadside said. His voice was hollow. "Marcus filed the complaint. The complaint got buried, and Crutchfield was going to—" "We don't know that," Coldwater interrupted. "We can't prove intent. The policy was never paid out. Marcus is alive." "Because someone got Marcus out," Kane said quietly. "Someone moved him before Crutchfield could finish what he started." "Or Marcus ran," Flintlock said. "He was 16, old enough to disappear." Kane pulled his phone. "We need to find Marcus Tilley. Now." At 11:03 p.m., a black sedan pulled into the Vidalia Hells Angels clubhouse parking lot. Federal plates, 2 occupants. The driver stayed in the car. The passenger got out. Special Agent Victoria Carter, FBI Atlanta Field Office, Financial Crimes Division. 43 years old. Practical gray suit. No jewelry. The kind of woman who'd been working this case longer than she wanted to admit, and had the exhaustion to prove it. She walked into the clubhouse without knocking. Kane stood from the table. The room went quiet. "Mr. Darden," Carter said, "I'm told you have something relevant to an open federal investigation." "Depends on what you're investigating," Kane replied. "New Horizons Youth Services, Randall Crutchfield, DFCS billing fraud." Carter's eyes swept the room. "And based on the number of motorcycles outside, I'm guessing you've already done half my job for me." "How long has your office known about Crutchfield?" Kane asked. Carter's expression tightened. 4 months. We've been building a case. Carefully. By the book." 4 months, Kane repeated. "And while you were building it, an 8-year-old girl was being targeted because her mother processed the audit paperwork that triggered your investigation." Carter had no good response. The silence confirmed it. "We got her out in 3 hours, Kane said. "You had 4 months. Carter's jaw locked, but she didn't argue. She couldn't. "What do you have?" she asked. Kettledrum pushed his laptop across the table. Financial records showing $517,080 in documented theft. Ghost placements. Fraudulent billings dating back to 2017. Personal transfers from a non-profit operating account. Asset purchases including a trailer, land, and country club membership. Carter reviewed the screen. Her expression shifted. "This fills a gap we haven't been able to close," she said quietly. "We had the billing records. We didn't have the personal transfers or the asset trail." Coldwater slid the envelope across the table. Marcus Tilley's original 2021 complaint. Buried by a DFCS supervisor. The supervisor's willing to testify about how it was suppressed. Carter opened the envelope, read the first page, set her pen down. "If this is authenticated," she said slowly, "it changes the scope of the charges significantly." Kane leaned forward. "We have one condition for full cooperation." Carter waited. Olive Pruitt gets a victim advocate assigned before the first interview. Nobody talks to her without her mother present. And the second arrest, Alan Gaines, the supervisor who buried Marcus's complaint, that happens this week, not after another month of paperwork. Carter looked at Kane for a long moment. "We'll be in touch." She started to leave. Kane called after her. "Agent Carter." She turned. "You do right by these children. A beat. That's the job, Mr. Darden." The scope of what Kane and his brothers had uncovered spread across the clubhouse table like an autopsy report. Victim count, 3 confirmed. Marcus Tilley, 2 ghost placements. 1 attempted. Olive Pruitt. Unknown additional victims across 9 years of operation. Total financial fraud, $517,080 documented. Estimated actual total pending full audit, $680,000 to $750,000. Timeline: January 2017 through present, 9 years of systematic theft from a state system designed to protect the most vulnerable children in Georgia. Charges to be filed: grand theft, multiple counts, wire fraud, federal, child endangerment, attempted kidnapping, conspiracy to defraud government agency, insurance fraud, attempted, obstruction of justice. Co-conspirators identified: Randall Eugene Crutchfield, primary; Alan Gaines, former DFCS regional supervisor, complaint suppression; Denise Holbrook, former DFCS intake supervisor, cooperating witness. Kettledrum closed his laptop. For 9 years, a system designed to catch exactly this kind of evil looked the other way, not because it couldn't see, because the people running it chose not to. Chainsaw's voice cut through the room. How many more Marcus Tillys are out there? How many children filed complaints that got buried? How many aged out thinking nobody gave a damn? Nobody had an answer. Kane looked around the table at the men who'd dropped everything to show up. Coldwater with his case files, Flintlock with his trauma kit, Broadside with his counselor's gentle questions, Kettledrum with his laptop, Chainsaw with his grief he'd carried for 27 years. We can't fix the system, Kane said quietly. We can't bring back the time those children lost. But we can make sure Randall Crutchfield never has the chance to do this again. Every man in that room nodded. Justice had been served. But justice wasn't the ending. It was only the beginning. At 7:14 a.m. on Friday morning, 21 hours after Randall Crutchfield had been taken into custody, Flintlock Odom sat in the waiting room of Meadows Regional Medical Center with a bag of Skittles he'd picked up at the gas station and a trauma kit he hadn't needed to open. Olive Pruitt was in examination room 3 with her mother and Dr. Sarah Kowalski, a pediatrician who'd been practicing in Vidalia for 16 years and had learned to recognize the specific way a child held their body when something had been done to them that they didn't have words for yet. Flintlock didn't go in. This wasn't his space. But he'd driven Rebecca and Olive here at 6:30 that morning because Rebecca's car had a check engine light that had been on for 2 months, and she couldn't afford to fix it, and because Flintlock was 63 years old and had sat with enough pain in his life to know that sometimes the most important thing you could do was just show up and wait. The examination took 47 minutes. When the door opened, Dr. Kowalski stepped out first. She looked at Flintlock, nodded once, then walked to the nurse's station to file her report. Rebecca came out next, holding Olive's hand. Olive's right wrist was wrapped in a soft bandage. Not a cast, just compression wrap over the 4 whitened crescents where Crutchfield's fingers had dug in hard enough to bruise the small bones underneath. Nothing broken, Rebecca said quietly. Some soft tissue damage. She'll need to keep it wrapped for a week, then physical therapy for the grip strength. Flintlock knelt, slowly. His knees didn't bend the way they used to, but he got down to Olive's level and held out the bag of Skittles. Doc says you were real brave in there, he said gently. Thought you might want these. Olive took the bag. Her left hand, the one that had made the signal, the one that had pressed against her chest, the one that had trusted a stranger in a black vest to understand what nobody else had seen, opened it carefully. She pulled out a yellow Skittle, held it up to the fluorescent light. My dress was yellow, she said. The day it happened. I know, sweetheart. My mom ironed it that morning. It's a Thursday dress. She bought it for the first day of school. Flintlock's throat tightened. That's a good dress. A brave dress. Olive nodded. Then she did something that made Rebecca's eyes fill and Flintlock's jaw lock. She put the yellow Skittle in his hand. You keep it, she said. So you remember. Flintlock closed his fingers around it. I won't forget. When they walked out to the parking lot 10 minutes later, Dr. Kowalski's report was already in the system. Contusions consistent with restraint force, minor ligament strain, psychological trauma requiring follow-up care. The report included photographs, time-stamped, documented, the kind of evidence that turned a he said, she said into a case file that couldn't be argued away. Flintlock drove them home. The yellow Skittle stayed in his vest pocket. At 12:47 p.m. that same Friday, Olive sat at the small kitchen table in the apartment at 3619 Sycamore Mill Road, apartment 2B, and ate a peach, not from a vending machine. From a bag Rebecca had bought at the Piggly Wiggly that morning, with money that had appeared in her checking account overnight, a deposit labeled Emergency Family Support Fund, HAGC, that brought her balance from $1,740 to $9,740. Rebecca had called the bank. The bank confirmed the deposit was legitimate. Hell's Angels, Georgia chapter, no strings attached. She'd sat on the kitchen floor and cried for 20 minutes. Now Olive ate the peach slowly, juice running down her chin, and Rebecca didn't tell her to be careful about her shirt. Because carefulness could come later. Right now, Olive was eating without watching the door, without checking the clock, without that rigid stillness that had lived in her shoulders for 11 weeks. The apartment smelled like peaches and morning coffee. Outside, a lawnmower hummed, a dog barked, normal sounds. Olive finished the peach and wiped her hands on her yellow dress, the same one, washed 3 times since Thursday, the white buttons still intact. "Mom," she said quietly, "can I keep wearing yellow?" Rebecca's voice broke. "Baby, you can wear yellow every single day for the rest of your life if you want to." Olive nodded. Then she stood up, walked to the small closet by the front door, and pulled out her white canvas sneakers, the ones with the sunflower drawn in red marker on the left toe. She'd drawn it herself on a rainy afternoon 2 months ago. A small bright spot, a piece of something good. She put the shoes on, tied them carefully with her left hand, her right wrist still wrapped. "I'm ready," she said. "Ready for what, baby?" "To go outside." The housing situation stabilized within 72 hours. Rebecca Pruitt's landlord at 3619 Sycamore Mill Road was a man named Vernon Hodge, 68 years old, who'd bought the building in 1987 and had evicted exactly 3 tenants in 37 years, all for reasons that involved property damage or threats. On Saturday morning, Vernon received a phone call from a man who identified himself as Cody Reese, calling on behalf of the Hells Angels, Georgia chapter. The conversation lasted 4 minutes. When it ended, Vernon walked across the parking lot to apartment 2B and knocked on Rebecca's door. "Miss Pruitt," he said when she answered, "I heard about what happened to your girl. I'm real sorry that man got as close as he did." Rebecca nodded, not trusting her voice. "I've been thinking," Vernon continued. "This building needs a property manager, someone to handle maintenance requests, coordinate repairs, keep an eye on things. 20 hours a week, $840 a month. You interested?" Rebecca stared at him. "Mr. Hodge, I don't have property management experience." "You work in courthouse records. You know how to track paperwork and deal with people. That's 90% of the job right there." He paused. "And the position comes with a 50% rent reduction. Your apartment would run you $340 a month instead of $680. Rebecca's legs went weak. "Why are you offering me this?" Vernon looked at her for a long moment. "Because a man called me this morning and asked if I'd be willing to help a single mother who'd just been through hell. And because my own daughter was in foster care once, back when I was young and stupid and couldn't get my life together. Someone helped her when I couldn't. Figure it's my turn to pass that on." He held out his hand. "You start Monday if you want it." Rebecca shook his hand. Then she closed the door, slid down to the kitchen floor, and cried for the second time in 3 days. Olive sat beside her, put her small hand on her mother's shoulder. "We're okay now," Olive said. "Right, Mom?" "Yeah, baby," Rebecca whispered. "We're okay now." On Sunday afternoon, the brothers came to say goodbye. Not all 113, just the 5 who'd sat at the table in the clubhouse and traced the money and found the evidence and built the case that would put Randall Crutchfield away for the next 14 years of his life. Coldwater came first. He brought a folder, thin, official-looking, stamped with the Toombs County Sheriff's Office seal. "Restraining order," he said, handing it to Rebecca. "Filed Friday. Approved yesterday. Crutchfield can't come within 500 feet of you or Olive. Can't contact you by phone, email, letter, or third party. Violates it. He goes straight back to jail." Rebecca took the folder with shaking hands. "Thank you." Coldwater looked at Olive. "You did good, kid. Real good. You remembered what they taught you. You made the signal, and you didn't give up. That's the bravest thing I've seen in 22 years. Broadside came next. He knelt, not all the way down, just enough to meet Olive's eyes, and pulled a small card from his wallet. "My phone number," he said. "You ever need to talk to someone who gets it? Someone who knows what it's like when adults don't listen the first time? You call me. Anytime. Day or night. I mean it." Olive took the card. "You're a counselor." "I was. Now I just try to be someone who shows up when it matters." Kettledrum brought his laptop, showed Olive the financial trail he'd mapped, not the details, just the concept. How money left a trail. How numbers told stories. How even people who thought they'd covered their tracks left evidence behind. "You're good at remembering things," he said. "That phone call you heard. You remembered it word for word. That's a skill. Don't lose it." Olive nodded seriously. "I won't." Chainsaw stood at the door. He didn't come in. Didn't speak much. Just looked at Olive for a long moment with eyes that had seen too much and still chose to see one more thing. A little girl who'd made it home. "You're safe now," he said. Just that. Nothing else. It was enough. Kane came last. He stood in the doorway of apartment 2B with the afternoon light behind him and an envelope in his hand that held the documentation Kettledrum had compiled. Every fraudulent transaction, every ghost placement, every piece of evidence that would be entered into federal court when Randall Crutchfield's trial began in 6 months. "This goes to the FBI tomorrow," Kane said, "but I wanted you to see it first. Wanted you to know that what you heard, that phone call 3 weeks ago, that's what broke this whole thing open." He handed the envelope to Rebecca. "Marcus Tilley is alive. We found him Thursday night. He's 22 now, living in Macon. He's agreed to testify." Rebecca's hand went to her mouth. "He said to tell Olive thank you," Kane continued. "Said if she hadn't remembered his name, if she hadn't been brave enough to repeat what she'd heard, he'd still be carrying what happened to him alone." Kane looked at Olive. "You helped more people than just yourself, sweetheart. You know that?" Olive nodded. Her eyes were wet. Kane knelt, pulled back his left sleeve. The name Caleb faced the light. "I told you I showed up," he said quietly. "That's still true. But you did the hard part. You made the signal. You trusted someone scary-looking to see you. That takes more courage than anything I did." Olive looked at the name on his wrist. "Who was Caleb?" Kane's voice went soft. "My son. He was 6 years old. He was in a foster care placement while I was deployed overseas. Something happened to him. Something that shouldn't have happened. And by the time I got home, it was too late." Olive's small hand reached out, touched the script letters. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "Me too, sweetheart." Kane's jaw tightened. "But you know what? For 17 years I've been looking for him. Not Caleb specifically, but the child whose signal nobody sees, the one whose voice nobody amplifies, the one who's alone on a street and running out of options. He met her eyes. "Thursday afternoon, I found you, and that means everything." He stood, nodded once to Rebecca, turned to leave. Olive called after him. "Kane?" He stopped. "If you ever need someone to remember something important," she said, her voice small but clear, "you can call me." Kane smiled, the first real smile Rebecca had seen on his face. "I'll remember that," he said. And then he walked out, his boots heavy on the stairs, his vest catching the afternoon sun. The door closed. The apartment went quiet. Olive stood at the window and watched him climb onto his motorcycle. Watched 112 other bikes pull out in formation, engines rumbling like thunder that shook the building's foundation. She raised her left hand, pressed it to the glass. Kane looked back once, nodded. Then the formation turned onto the county road and disappeared into distance that smelled like motor oil and September, and something that felt like safety. 3 weeks after Randall Crutchfield was indicted on 17 federal and state charges, Kane Darden stood outside Toombs County Primary School at dismissal time and watched children stream out the front doors in waves of backpacks and laughter. He hadn't planned to be here. He'd been driving past on his way to a parts supplier in Lyon, and something had pulled him off the highway. The same instinct that had made him stop on the courthouse steps, the same gravity that had bent his path toward a little girl in a yellow dress. He parked his bike across the street, stayed on the far side of the chain-link fence where a man his size, his age, his appearance, wouldn't alarm the teachers shepherding their students to waiting cars. And then he saw her. Olive Pruitt, 3rd grade, 8 years old. Yellow dress, a new one, slightly different cut, but the same bright color that had caught his eye 3 weeks ago. White sneakers with a sunflower on the left toe. Walking beside 2 other girls, talking, laughing, her right hand swinging free at her side, the bandage finally removed. She looked like a child, just a child, not a victim carrying the weight of what almost happened, not a girl who'd counted landmarks and run calculations, and made a signal 3 times before someone finally saw. Just a 3rd grader, walking with friends. Kane watched her climb into Rebecca's car, the same sedan with the check engine light, now repaired with money from the Emergency Family Support Fund the chapter had quietly established. Watched Rebecca lean across the seat and hand Olive something. Watched Olive's face light up. A peach. From the vending machine at the courthouse where Rebecca still worked, processing records, including the mountain of paperwork that would eventually send Randall Crutchfield to federal prison for 14 years with no parole eligibility. The car pulled away. Olive waved to her friends through the window. Kane stayed there for another minute. 2. He didn't wave, didn't call out. This moment wasn't about him. But he felt something shift in his chest. Not healing. Healing didn't work that way. But something loosening. A weight redistributing. The understanding that what was taken from Caleb 17 years ago couldn't be returned, only worked around. And that every time Kane showed up for a child who needed someone to see them, he was building something that mattered. Not redemption. He'd stopped believing in redemption a long time ago. Just presence. Just the choice to look when everyone else looked away. He pulled his phone from his pocket, scrolled to a folder labeled Caleb. Inside, 17 years of messages, case files, photographs. And now, at the bottom, one new entry. A text from Rebecca, sent 2 days ago. 3 words. She's doing better. Kane closed the folder, started his bike. The rumble cut through the afternoon quiet. He didn't look back. But he carried Olive with him the same way he'd carried Caleb for 17 years, not as a weight that broke him, but as a reason to keep showing up. 6 months later, on a Wednesday morning in early March, Olive Pruitt stood at a podium in the Toombs County Primary School auditorium and taught 300 children how to make a signal that could save their lives. She wore a yellow dress, ironed flat that morning by her mother, white sneakers with a fresh sunflower drawn on the left toe. She redrew it every few months when the marker started to fade. Principal Hernandez had asked her 3 weeks ago if she'd be willing to give a presentation about personal safety. Olive had said yes before her mother could say no. "Good morning, students and parents," Principal Hernandez said into the microphone. "Today, we have a very special assembly about personal safety. We're going to learn about the rescue signal, a silent way to ask for help when you're in danger. And we have a very brave young lady here to teach you. Please welcome Olive Pruitt." Applause filled the auditorium. Olive walked to the microphone. The lights were bright. The crowd was bigger than she'd expected. For a moment, panic threatened. The same panic that had lived in her chest for 11 weeks, while Randall Crutchfield had watched her at the community center, learned her patterns, calculated his approach. Then she saw her mother in the front row, pressing her hand to her heart. And somehow, that gave Olive the courage to begin. "Hi," she said. Her voice was small but clear. "My name is Olive, and I'm in 3rd grade. 6 months ago, something scary happened to me." The auditorium went completely silent. "A man who volunteered at my after-school program tried to take me. He told me my mom had sent him to pick me up. She hadn't. For 11 weeks before that, he'd been watching me, learning things about me and my family. I felt uncomfortable around him, but I didn't say anything because I thought maybe I was just being silly." Olive paused, made eye contact with a kindergartner in the 2nd row. "But I wasn't being silly. My feelings were trying to warn me that something was wrong, and the day he tried to take me, I was really scared. I couldn't scream because he said if I made noise, he'd hurt my mom. I couldn't run because he was stronger than me." She raised her right hand, but I remembered something I learned in a police officer's presentation at school last year. This is called the rescue signal. Olive demonstrated slowly. You take your hand like this, palm facing out. Then you tuck your thumb into your palm, and fold your fingers down over it, like you're trapping your thumb. Around the auditorium, 300 students began practicing the gesture, their small hands mimicking hers. You hold it for 3 seconds where someone can see it, then lower your hand. It's a silent way to tell someone, "I'm in danger. Please help me." Olive's voice grew stronger. But here's the important part. It only works if someone brave enough is looking. She scanned the back of the auditorium, looking for the person she knew would be there, even though he'd never said he was coming. And there he was. Kane Darden stood in the shadows near the exit, partially hidden by the door frame. He wore a dark suit instead of his vest, respect for the school environment. His arms were crossed. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes were focused entirely on her with an intensity that felt protective rather than frightening. Their gazes met for just a moment. Olive smiled. Kane's expression softened, almost imperceptibly. Then Olive continued, "I made the signal 3 times on the courthouse steps that day. 11 people walked past me. They didn't see it. Not because they were bad people, because most adults don't know what it means." She demonstrated again, encouraging the students to practice with her. "That's why I'm here, to teach you the signal, and to ask you to teach someone else. Your parents, your grandparents, your teachers. Because someday, you might be the person who needs help. Or you might be the person who can give it." Her voice dropped, becoming more serious. "Pay attention to people around you. Notice when something seems wrong. Don't just walk by because it's not your problem. Because someday, you might be the only person who can help someone who really needs it." The auditorium erupted in applause, not the polite clapping of a school assembly, genuine, enthusiastic appreciation. Olive stepped back, feeling tears prick her eyes as she took in the crowd of students, all practicing the signal, all learning something that might save their lives someday. Her mother was crying openly in the front row, and in the back of the auditorium, Kane Darden gave her the smallest nod. Acknowledgement, approval, respect, before turning and slipping out the door. 3 years and 4 months after Randall Crutchfield was sentenced to 14 years in federal prison, Olive Pruitt, now 11 years old, 6th grade, still wearing yellow every Thursday, walked into the Toombs County Community Center for the first time since the day she'd been taken from its front steps. She was there as a volunteer. The new director, installed after the previous administration had been thoroughly investigated and restructured, had reached out to Rebecca 2 weeks ago. They were starting a peer mentorship program for younger children. Would Olive be interested in helping? Olive had said yes. Now she sat in the same room where she'd once waited for her mother, where Randall Crutchfield had studied her patterns and calculated his approach. But the room was different now. New paint, new furniture, new faces, and sitting across from her, small and quiet, and clutching a worn backpack, was a 7-year-old girl named Emma Carter, whose mother worked 2 jobs and whose after-school program was the only safe place she had between 3 p.m. and 7 p.m. Emma hadn't said a word in 10 minutes. Olive recognized the look. She'd worn it for 11 weeks, that combination of terror and hope and exhaustion, the face of someone who'd been failed enough times to stop expecting anything, but hadn't quite given up yet. "Hi," Olive said gently. "I'm Olive. I'm here on Thursdays. You can talk to me about anything, or we can just sit here. Whatever you need." Emma looked at her. "Do you know the rescue signal?" Olive's breath caught. "Yeah," she said quietly. "I know it." "Do you?" Emma nodded. "My teacher taught us last month. She said a girl at this school invented it." "I didn't invent it," Olive said. "But I used it once. It worked." Emma's eyes went wide. "Really?" "Really." Olive pulled out her phone, scrolled to a photograph she'd saved 3 years ago. The courthouse steps, the yellow dress, the moment after Kane had knelt in front of her and said, "I see you." "See this," Olive said. "This is me on the day someone tried to take me. And this." She scrolled to the next photo, the one Rebecca had taken 2 weeks later. Olive and Kane standing outside the clubhouse after the fundraiser that had raised $11,340 for the community center safety program. "This is me, with the person who saw my signal." Emma stared at the photo, at the large man in the Hells Angels vest, at the small girl in the yellow dress standing beside him, smiling. "He looks scary," Emma whispered. "He did," Olive agreed. "But he was the person I needed right then, because the scariest-looking person in a room can sometimes be exactly who you need." She put the phone away. "If you ever need help, Emma, you make that signal, and if someone ever makes you uncomfortable, even if they're nice, even if everyone says they're safe, you trust your feelings, okay?" Emma nodded slowly. Then she reached into her backpack and pulled out a piece of paper, drew something on it, handed it to Olive, a sunflower, in red crayon. "That's on your shoe," Emma said. "I saw it when you sat down." Olive looked at the drawing, at the careful petals, at the small signature in the corner. Emma, age 7. "Can I keep this?" Olive asked. "Yeah." Olive folded it carefully, put it in her pocket, right next to the laminated school photo she still carried everywhere, her second-grade portrait in a yellow blouse, the one her mother had laminated at the public library 3 years ago. "Thank you," Olive said. "I'll keep it safe." Emma smiled, small, uncertain, but real, and Olive Pruitt, who'd been the terrified 8-year-old on the courthouse steps, who'd made a signal 3 times before someone finally saw, who'd learned that being saved didn't always look like rescue, but sometimes just looked like someone who refused to look away. Understood something profound. She wasn't just the girl who'd been helped. She was the person who could help someone else. Kane Darden kept a folder on his phone labeled Caleb. Inside were 17 years of memories, case files, photographs. And one by one, over the years since that Thursday afternoon on the courthouse steps, new entries had appeared. A text from Rebecca. She's doing better. A photo from the school assembly. Olive at the podium, teaching 300 children. A newspaper clipping. Local girls' presentation inspires county-wide safety program. A message from Olive herself, sent on her 11th birthday. Thank you for seeing me. I'm teaching other kids now. Kane scrolled through them on a Saturday morning in April, sitting on his porch with coffee that had gone cold, and sunshine that felt warmer than it had in years. His phone buzzed. New message. Unknown number. Mr. Darden, this is Marcus Tilley. I testified yesterday. They found him guilty on all counts. Thank you for believing me when it mattered. And thank Olive for me. Tell her she helped more people than she knows. Kane stared at that message for a long time. Randall Eugene Crutchfield, 47 years old, licensed foster care coordinator, 9 years of stealing from children who had nothing, convicted on 17 counts, sentenced to 14 years in federal prison. No parole eligibility. Justice. But more than that, validation. For Marcus. For Olive. For every child who'd been told their feelings were wrong, their complaints weren't credible, their fear was just imagination. Kane saved the message, added it to the folder. Then he walked to his bike, parked in the gravel driveway. The name Caleb on his left wrist caught the sunlight. He'd been looking for his son for 17 years. Not Caleb specifically, but the child whose signal nobody saw, the one whose voice nobody amplified, the one who needed someone to show up when the system looked away. On a Thursday afternoon in September, he'd found Olive Pruitt, and in finding her, he'd found something else. Not redemption, not healing, just the understanding that loss could teach instead of destroy. That grief could be carried without drowning in it. That showing up, again and again, courthouse after courthouse, case file after case file, was the only thing that mattered. Kane climbed onto his bike. The engine roared to life. He didn't know where he was going, just knew he was going, because somewhere out there, another child was making a signal. Another person was walking past without seeing. And Kane Darden would keep looking until he found them. That was the job. That was the promise. That was Caleb's legacy, and Olive's gift, and the only thing Kane knew how to do with 17 years of grief and 3 hours of grace. He pulled out onto the county road. The morning air smelled like motor oil and possibility. Behind him, the folder stayed open on his phone, waiting for the next entry. This story isn't really about motorcycles or courthouse steps, or a foster care coordinator's 14-year prison sentence. It's about the moment you choose to see what everyone else is trained to miss. Because here's the truth that Olive Pruitt learned on a Thursday afternoon when 11 people walked past her. Being invisible isn't the same as being absent. And being seen, truly, fully seen by one person who refuses to look away, can be the difference between a child who makes it home and a child who doesn't. If you've ever felt invisible, if you've ever been the person everyone walked past, if you've ever wondered whether anyone would notice if you just disappeared, this story is for you. You matter. Your signal matters. And there are people looking. But here's the harder truth, the one that sits heavier. If you've ever been the person who walked past because it wasn't your problem, because you were late, because you convinced yourself someone else would handle it, that's not cruelty. That's human. We all do it. The bystander effect has a name because it's universal. But it has a cost. And that cost was carried by an 8-year-old girl in a yellow dress for 90 seconds until the right man came down the courthouse steps. Learn the rescue signal. Teach it to your children, your grandchildren, the people you love. It's simple. Thumb tucked into palm, 4 fingers folded over it, held for 3 seconds. Silent, desperate, powerful, and be the person who's looking. Pay attention. Notice when something feels wrong. Ask the uncomfortable questions. Care enough to intervene, even if your voice shakes. You don't need 100 motorcycles to change a story. You just need to stop walking. If this story moved you, subscribe to Gentle Biker Official and share it with someone who needs to hear that heroes don't always look like heroes, and that sometimes the scariest-looking person in a room is exactly who a child needs. Drop a comment telling me, who was the person who saw you when no one else did? Or what do you wish someone had done? I've got more stories coming that prove the same thing Olive Pruitt proved on those courthouse steps. That courage doesn't always roar, that signals don't always make sound, and that showing up is everything. Now, picture this. A little girl in a yellow dress, 8 years old, walking beside a man who wasn't her father. 11 people walking past. One Hell's Angel who stopped on the 3rd step and understood what her fingers were saying. And in that moment, in those 3 seconds when her hand rose and her thumb tucked and her hope hung in the September air, everything changed. Not because the system finally worked, but because one person chose to see.